record it locally, and I'll upload it later on. That's frustrating, but you know, technology doesn't always work perfectly. All right, well, that certainly was a long enough delay as we wrestled with technology. Hopefully everyone else is having more luck, but it is what it is. So we are picking up in chapter 4 of Chullin, and we are carrying on with our conversation of the grisly details of what happens with various unusual births. I'll just say again, as something I've talked about in many other Mishnah classes, it may seem unusual that we are beginning with some, shall we say, not typical situations, nor situations that may seem relevant to the average person today. They were certainly not typical situations even in the ancient world. But the Mishnah was written according to a set of teachings to make it as easy to remember and to flow, and was not meant to be an introduction to a topic. It was meant to be your review notes, the bits that you had memorized and which, when recited and called to mind, you could then expand upon. As such, the structure was not meant to take a person through a topic from basic principles through advanced and more advanced and advanced topics. Which is why we're eventually going to loop back on some of the tangents that we mentioned here and look at them in more detail in later chapters. But that is just a feature of the Mishnah. If you want a systemic approach, meaning starting with baby steps and moving your way through a topic, building little by little, then by all means turn to the Mishnah Torah. Rambam's elucidation of Jewish law is the most systematic that I've ever come across. There have been some in the modern worlds, but they tend to get a little more cluttered down with other details. His is the cleanest, simplest core teaching that will help. So if you're looking for that type of building through a topic, you need to look somewhere else. The Mishnah is here as our main repository of all the information, but it's not organized in a way that is user-friendly to the beginner, I know. With that in mind, let's reach in and deal with another touchy topic. If a fetus died within the womb of its mother, and the shepherd put his hand in his hand and touched it, he is clean, whether it was a clean or unclean animal, right? So this is a baby that is inside the womb still, and it is dead inside the mother. It is a miscarriage, and the shepherd or the cattle rancher reaches in to the womb in order to first tell that it is dead, and then secondly, of course, he'll be trying to remove it for the health and safety of the mother. The question is, this is a dead body inside the womb. Yes, that's what makes it an interesting point, because we know that if it was just a dead body that is lying on the side of the road in the field, that counts as nevelah. And as nevelah, if he were to touch it, he becomes ritually impure. Remember, again, being ritually impure is only important for certain ritual aspects. This is not like the end of the world. But the teaching that we have here is that if he reaches in and touches the animal and it's still inside the womb, then it is considered to be not transmitting ritual impurity, whether the animal that he is touching is either a clean animal or unclean. That is to say, whether it is a sheep or a goat or a cow, or whether it is a horse or a donkey, for example. All right, now, thankfully, Rabbi Kolp gives us the explanation for the derivation of this, which the Talmud goes into more detail, that this is a kal v'chomer, an all the more so type argument. If a clean animal is slaughtered and found to be pregnant, her fetus can be eaten based on the mother's valid slaughtering. It is not considered nevelah. All the more so, a fetus that dies within a live mother is not considered to be nevelah because its mother is alive. right? So just to make sure that you understand what the argument is that if we are slaughtering an animal and we find that there is a fetus inside of it, and the fetus has the status of the mother, meaning slaughtered correctly, even though it itself was not slaughtered, and that means it's not nevela, then all the more so, if the mother is still alive, then that fetus should still not be considered nevela because the mother is alive. If the fetus takes the status of the mother, then with the mother being alive, it should have that status as well, and therefore not be considered nevela and not transmit ritual impurity, whether it is alive or dead. I should point out that living animals cannot contract ritual impurity. They are immune, if you will, from contracting ritual impurity in any way. Now, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili argues about this. If it was an unclean animal, he is unclean. And if it was a clean animal, he is clean. So his argument is that if it is a donkey or horse, then that is an unclean animal. And so it would count as a nevela. But if it is a sheep or goat or cow, then not a problem. Now, again, Rabbi Kopp points out, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says that there is no kal v'chomer argument when it comes to the unclean argument, because when its mother is slaughtered, and the fetus does not become fit for eating, right? The fetus does not gain its mother's status as having been properly slaughtered, because you cannot properly slaughter a non-kosher animal and call it proper, because it's not kosher. So therefore, it is nevela regardless. Now, the law does not go by Rabbi Yossi. It does follow the sages. Point number 2: if the fetus of a woman died within the womb of its mother, and the midwife put in her hand and touched it, the midwife is unclean for 7 days. That is to say, she has contracted the normal ritual impurity that comes from touching a corpse, but the mother is clean until the fetus comes out. Now, if the human fetus dies within its mother's womb and the midwife touches it while it is still inside, the midwife is unclean for 7 days, as I mentioned, as is the rule for someone who comes in contact with a corpse. However, as he points out, according to the Talmud, this impurity is not deoraita. That is not literally from the Torah, but is rather a rabbinic decree. From the Torah, since the fetus is still in its mother, it does not count as a separate life. However, the rabbis decreed that it should make her impure lest she touch it after its head had already emerged, meaning the midwife. The mother is considered clean from corpse impurity unless the head emerges and then the baby dies. All right, so I just want to point out a little bit, we've been talking a lot about fetuses and wombs over the last few sessions, and it may seem insensitive to some students that we are talking about these things interchangeably between animals and human beings. This is one of the features of the way the Mishnah is composed that can seem insensitive until you realize that the composition was not designed to teach you how to feel about a topic, but merely how to adjudicate about a topic. Obviously, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, we draw large distinctions between a human and an animal. However, the rabbis are trying to merely and concisely elucidate the rulings on these different topics. If it seems like they are lacking in sensitivity, recognize that this is not how they would talk to a family that had, God forbid, experienced a miscarriage or stillbirth. This is not the way they would be just coldly and callously calculating the impurity status for a midwife who had dealt with such a difficult and traumatic situation as having to reach in to try and help deliver a stillbirth and for the good of the mother. They are merely trying to clarify what would the actual law be. In person, in practice, in all ways that life actually takes place, the rabbis would approach with much more sensitivity, warmth, and caring, as you would expect. The law would remain the law, but the way that it would be explained and and given to the people involved would have a very different emotional value to it. And I know that for many people, the reading of the Mishnah can feel very sterile, and I appreciate that. It's not the way that many people would read modern books on the topic, which would be written with greater sensitivity and certainly a greater distance between the rules concerning animals and the rules concerning people. However, if you do look at a modern law book, you'll find something more similar, meaning if you're looking at the actual list of statutes and regulations, there is very little moralizing or emotionalizing of a particular topic. That is saved, of course, for the personal interaction, and the law is kept limited to the primary focus of conveying the information as needed to understand how to rule in different cases. But the fact that it's written this way, again, should not trivialize the emotional devastation that would be experienced for a family going through something like a miscarriage in this way. All right, any questions or comments about Mishnah 4.3? Then we will move on to 4.4, which is continuing in a similar situation. So, as Rabbi Kolb points out in his introduction, if a fetus sticks a limb out while being born, and someone cuts off that limb before slaughtering the mother, the limb causes impurity as would a nevelah, as do all limbs taken from living animals. This is the principle of ever min hachai, or min hachai. When you take a body part from a living creature while it is still alive, that body part is considered nevelah. It is a transgressed act and definitely causes ritual impurity. Our Mishnah teaches that in this case, the fetus that remains in the mother does not have the status of nevelah and it's clean. The rabbis in our Mishnah debate whether the same is true if they slaughtered the mother first and then cut off the limb off the fetus. All right, so this is going to get a little tricky. So let's work through each section bit by bit. If an animal was having difficulty in labor and the fetus put forth its limb, meaning it exited the birth canal, and a person immediately cut it off and then slaughtered the mother, the flesh of the fetus is clean. All right, so this is the standard case. This is the easy case, right? So the limb that was cut off would be considered unclean, but the rest of the fetus inside the mother, assuming everything else went appropriately, is considered to be ritually pure. Now, you may be wondering why or how would the situation occur? Well, this actually is a little bit more likely. So if you work with me through a little bit of a hypothetical, maybe you'll appreciate the difficult situation for farmers. So you have a cow, and the cow is trying to give birth, but it is having difficulty. And in the process of trying to give birth, the breech animal puts out a leg, and you want to save the mother cow more than you want to save the calf. So you cut off the leg, hoping that that will make it easier for the rest of the body to exit, that if it turns again, it won't catch, it won't tear, it won't be an obstruction, that it will make the rest of the delivery easier. So you had good reasons for cutting off that extra leg. However, it doesn't seem to work. The animal still seems like it is not going to deliver, and as such, there's a very high chance that the cow will die. Well, if the cow dies, then it is nevelah. But if you slaughter it before the cow dies, then you can make it kasher. And indeed, as they say, not only would the mother be kosher, but the fetus inside would also be kosher. Right? And even, as Rabbi Kolb points out, even if the fetus dies while it is still inside, as long as the mother is slaughtered correctly, then it is still considered to be just like every other part of the mother. And as such, since the mother is slaughtered kosher, then so is the fetus. It's like, if you slaughter the mother, the leg becomes kosher, not only the neck. And if you slaughter the mother, the fetus becomes kosher, not only the leg. All right, so that is the vanilla standard, probably slightly more likely situation that might occur. And I want to make sure we're clear on that before we get to the argument. Okay, now the argument. If he slaughtered the mother first and then cut it off, the flesh of the fetus is unclean, like that which had touched nevelah, the words of Rabbi Meir. All right, so let's make sure we have the scenario first. If after the fetus sticks out its limb, the mother is slaughtered, and then he cuts off the limb, we now have a case of cut off limb, that removal from a living creature, touching a dead fetus. Rabbi Meir holds that the fetus is rendered unclean by virtue of contact with the unclean limb. Remember, we'd said before that a living animal cannot contract ritual impurity. So this wasn't an issue with the mother when she was alive and any part of her contracting ritual impurity from that limb that was removed from the fetus while it was still alive in the mother and the mother was still alive. You with me? Rabbi Meir argues that since you have now killed the mother first, then the fetus is also considered dead. And that means as soon as you remove the limb, the fetus is now also considered slaughtered, but it is also alive. And when you remove the limb, probably trying to remove the rest of that fetus from the mother, that it is like touching it with an unclean limb, and therefore it is now considered to be ritually impure. It would be considered touching nevelah. All right, so that's Rabbi Meir's position. But the sages, right, the general rabbinic group, meaning the majority, say it is like that which had touched a slaughtered treifa. Right, so the other sages do not say that the limb would be the status of nevelah, which causes ritual impurity, but instead it is like treifa, meaning something that was slaughtered correctly, but found to have another invalidating circumstance. So they're arguing that because it is like treifa rather than a nevelah, it would not cause ritual impurity. We with me so far on their rebuttal? All right, they're going to try and establish this a little bit. For just as we find that the slaughtering of a treifa animal renders it clean, so the slaughtering of the animal renders the limb clean. Right? So the rabbis say that just as slaughtering renders a treifa clean, and it saves it from ever becoming an unclean nevelah, even though the meat is forbidden, so too slaughtering renders the limb clean, even though it cannot be eaten. Right? It turns it into treifa rather than nevelah, and thus we don't have an issue of impurity, even though we do still have an issue of kashrut. We're not allowed to eat from something that would be treif. Reminder again, we're using the technical term. All right. Rabbi Meir is going to come back. And again, this is unusual in the Mishnah. Oftentimes the Mishnah will give us a once back and forth, but doesn't usually give more give and take, what we call shaklavataria. But you're getting a little taste of what the Talmud looks like in this particular Mishnah. And Aaron, you have your hand up?
Yes, Rabbi, just to clarify, this all assumes that the entire fetus is inside the mother's body, right?
No, this assumes that the head has not come out of the mother's body.
All right. So when we learned, I think it was last week, that if a limb comes out, it has to be cut off before it becomes impure then, right?
Right. And so that's the argument here, is what happens if the limb comes out and then you kill the mother and then you cut off the limb? What is the status? We know what happens if the limb comes out and you kill the mother. Sorry, the limb comes out, you remove it, and then you slaughter the mother. But here we remove the limb after the mother has been slaughtered. So that's what creates the potential, according to Rabbi Meir, of considering the limb like it is nevelah, rather than like being treifa. All right, so Rabbi Meir is going to argue back. Rabbi Meir said to them, no, for when you say that the slaughtering of a treifa animal renders it clean, you are concerned with the animal itself. But can you say that it will render clean the limb, which is not a part of the animal itself? But Rabbi Meir, as Rabbi Kolb points out, Rabbi Meir rejects their argument. Slaughtering can render the treifel animal itself clean, meaning not causing ritual impurity. You still can't eat it. But how can it render clean a part of the fetus, the limb, that was not attached to the fetus when its mother was slaughtered? Rather, the limb has the status of nevela and renders the fetus unclean. And he goes on to continue the argument. From where do we learn that slaughtering a treifa animal renders it clean? So the Mishnah now begins a prolonged argument trying to prove that against Rabbi Meir, a slaughtered treifa is clean, even though its meat cannot be eaten. Okay, so hold on for some proof. For we could have argued the contrary. That is to say, we could have argued that an unclean animal may not be eaten, and a treifa also may not be eaten. Just as slaughtering does not render an unclean animal clean, so slaughtering should not render a treifa animal clean, right? We could have argued it along that line. However, in most rabbinic fashion, rabbis do not begin with the proof, but rather with the counterproof, what one might have argued. And we've talked about this before, that this is a standard rabbinic technique to argue what wrong version you might have gone to and how we know that's wrong, and therefore how we know what's right in its opposition. So seemingly, one might have compared the treifa with the unclean animal, meaning like just a pig, an animal that is not kosher in any way, shape, or form. Both an unclean animal and a treifa cannot be eaten. Therefore, one might have argued that just as shlita, slaughtering, does not render an unclean animal clean, for its meat transmits impurity, so too the slaughtering of a treifa renders it unclean and able to transmit impurity. So we might have had that argument, right? We might have gone down that road. No, that's not the right way to think about it, right? If you said this of an unclean animal, for at no time was it fit for slaughtering, can you also say this of a treifa animal, which had a time when it was fit for slaughtering, right? This is not an appropriate comparison. And again, I'll point out, again, for those of you that have studied with me before, but maybe for the first time, if you're just tuning in for the Mishnah classes, the rabbis will have to defuse arguments based on whether or not there are flaws in the logic of the analogy, comparison, or other technique that's being used to make a point. And here they are trying to say that the comparison between an unclean animal and a treifa animal doesn't work, because an unclean animal is 100% all the time unclean. It was unclean and not appropriate to ever become kosher at the moment it was born, and it was unclean when you slaughtered it, and it was unclean after that. A treifa animal, on the other hand, did have a window of opportunity when it could have been clean. It could have been permitted if it had been slaughtered at just the right moment. And as such, those two, the unclean and the treifa, are not 100% equal. And thus, we should expect that there are differences in how we treat the animals under different circumstances, right? So as Rabbi Kolb points out, right, the unclean animal never had the chance to become clean through slaughtering, but a treifa animal, if it had been slaughtered before it became a treifa, it would have been clean. Right? If you slaughter your cow before the wolf attacks it, then that would have been perfectly fine. Right? Therefore, we cannot combine them. There is not enough similarity. It is apples to oranges. Everyone okay on that step? Okay, because now they are going to push back even stronger against Rabbi Meir. Take away with this argument that you brought forth, right? Meaning basically like throwing it back in his face. From where would we know this of an animal that was born treifa from the womb, right? Would this work if we were to talk about an animal that had been born treif, right? So meaning that the distinction between an unclean animal and a treifa animal only works if the treifa animal actually did have a moment when it was fit to be slaughtered, which it then subsequently lost by whatever caused its treifa status. But if an animal was born treifa, I mean, if it was already born with the defect that would render it to be treif, then it never had that window of opportunity, right? And as such, maybe our argument from paragraph 9 does not stand up. So instead, we have to find an alternative argument to make the point. Substitute, therefore, this argument, meaning let's try this one instead. No, if you said this of an unclean animal, for none of its kind may be validly slaughtered, can you also state this of a treifa, for whose kind there is valid slaughter? Right? So yes, between an individual unclean and an individual treifa from birth, there may not be a difference of could it be ever kosher, but between the species of the unclean and the species of the treifa, even a treifa from birth, there is a distinction because other members of whatever is treifa from birth could be slaughtered. You know, a cow with a defect may not be, but another cow could be. So in fact, they are distinct, and as such, you cannot draw a parallel between the two. Everyone follow that final step? Maybe it's a little late. All right, part 12. Accordingly, the slaughtering of a live 8 months birth does not render it clean, since there is no slaughtering of its kind. Now, this rule, the rule that we posited in the previous section, is that any animal whose kind could be permitted by having been slaughtered is also clean if it is slaughtered, meaning clean, not contracting ritual impurity, not clean, meaning you can eat. Just always want to make sure we get that clear. And 8 months birth, which is a technical term, refers to an animal born prematurely, one which is deformed and we know will die. Right? The 8-month birth does not necessarily mean that every animal has 9 months for gestation. This is a catch-all phrase that is used as almost an idiom in rabbinics to mean premature, a non-viable birth. The Mishnah uses the term 8 months, as he points out, because a human baby born at 8 months is assumed to be non-viable. So an 8 months birth is like a treifa. It is like a treifa. It is an animal that is now alive that we know will die shortly. Because of the general rule explained above, an animal born prematurely cannot be made clean by shchita, meaning it will become nevela, because none of its kind can be permitted through shchita. Such an animal that is slaughtered will have the status of nevela, because it is impossible for it to ever live, nor could anything like it, meaning of its kind, live if under that same set of circumstances, being born non-viable. Thus, anything in that non-viable status will be considered nevela, regardless of how you slaughter. If you found that confusing, then now you understand why we're not doing this as a weekly daf class, because this is a very common back and forth kind of style of an argument for Talmud. If you find that that actually made a little bit of sense with the commentary and explanation, congratulations. You probably want to tune into some Talmud study because you might be getting the hang of it. All right, Mishnah 4:5. Just give me a second. In Florida, you always have to stay hydrated, even in the winter. Okay. We're continuing with our fetuses. I promise we're not going to stay in the womb forever. We're going to get out of here, but we need to get into some more detail regarding this topic. If one slaughtered an animal and found in it an 8 months fetus, either living or dead, or a 9 months fetus, he need only tear it open and take out the blood. If he found in it a living 9 months fetus, it must be slaughtered, and he would thereby possibly incur the penalty for it and its young. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. All right, so let's get Rabbi Meir's opinion on the table before we knock it down. So what he is saying is something that we've been talking about in the background for a lot of the last few Mishnayot, which is if you slaughter a pregnant mother and that cow or sheep or goat is found to be pregnant inside, then the fetus is considered to have already been slaughtered. The shchita for the mother's neck is considered to have also killed the baby inside because it is part of her. The same way that when you slaughter the mother, you don't have to worry about slaughtering her leg. When you slaughter the mother, you don't have to worry about slaughtering what's in the womb. However, Rabbi Meir argues that you do still need to take out the blood because that is an additional commandment not bound up in Shrita, that when you slaughter, you do need to still drain the blood. And so even though the fetus is considered slaughtered, although the knife hasn't touched it, you do still need to drain the blood. Now, Rabbi Meir argues that if you have a 9-month fetus, meaning a fully viable fetus, then that means that it has to actually have shchita, even if it was still inside the mother's fetus. If you slaughter it, you have to be careful about the commandment from Leviticus 22 of not slaughtering a mother and its young on the same day. That it would be still under that principle. It would be as though it were completely alive and had been born independent from the mother. Okay, does everyone follow Rabbi Meir's position? All right. But the sages say the slaughtering of the mother renders it permitted, meaning across all of it, right? Any fetus found in the mother, alive or dead, is permitted to be eaten without having been slaughtered itself. You still have to drain the blood, which, like we said, that applies to all meat. Now, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says, even if it is 8 years old and is plowing the field, the slaughtering of its mother renders it permitted. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, just make sure you understand what he is saying, look, if you had this mother and you slaughtered it, and inside the cow you found the baby cow, and you take the baby out, and the baby grows up, and the baby is running around the field, and it is now 8 years old and plowing, it's still considered to be pre-dead. It is still considered to be pre-slaughtered. And whatever you want, you can just go up, kill it, and eat it, and you don't have to do shchita. He is arguing that you technically don't have to slaughter it even years later, and that would be okay. Yes, Natan.
Can you use it for a korban?
That's a very interesting question. I will say I don't know because Rabbi Shazuri loses. His argument is overruled by the sages, but they overrule it on a precautionary note. They say technically he's right. Right? Technically the animal is already pre-slaughtered, but it would look wrong. It would just appear so wildly incorrect that even though technically it would be kosher and fit to be eaten, that one should not do such a thing, that one should not wait to slaughter the living young until it becomes easily mistaken for just being a regular other cow that you are not slaughtering correctly. So I don't think that anyone would have ever allowed it to come as a korban, but it's an interesting question whether Rabbi Shazuri would have said it was okay for it to come as a korban. My guess is that since it is already considered to be dead, that it's already considered to have had shrita, that you would not be allowed to bring it to the altar because nothing dead, technical or not, would be allowed as a sacrifice. But that is my logical argument. I don't have that as as something that I have studied explicitly. Aaron?
Yes, Rabbi. Did Rambam? How was Rambam able to do it then? Did he just avoid the fact that it could be mistaken as a bad slaughter, which it was?
So the famous story about Rambam, where a rabbi from Europe came to double check whether he was a heretic or not, because of Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, talks about him clubbing a calf to death. Now, it's unclear from that story, which may or may not even be true, whether as a calf, what they meant was a baby cow, meaning freshly from a slaughtered mother, or whether they meant like a cow that looked like any other cow. So it's unclear, but it is clear from the story that it was meant to be mistakable by the visiting rabbi, and in order to prove the point. But Rambam may have been trying to just prove the point, or, as is more likely the case, the story itself is apocryphal. It's part of what's called a hagiography, where we create beautiful stories about the wisdom or saintliness of our amazing historical figures that may not be grounded entirely in actual journalistic historical events. So it's the kind of thing that might have happened, but not the kind of thing that we should believe had to have happened.
But Rabbi, wouldn't it be weird to attribute a story like that to Rambam if it's, I mean, you're essentially attributing a mistaken halakha of Rambam if it's not true, though. Why would they?
Well, because a lot of things were attributed to people that don't always hold up very well. I mean, the whole story itself is a wonderful morality tale of don't judge a book by its cover, or don't judge a rabbi by one book you don't really understand. But the truth of the matter is, I don't for 1 minute believe that Rambam would have actually behaved that way had someone shown up questioning his validity. I think Rambam would have sat the guy down and talked to him and explained it in painstaking detail of why the criticisms were completely wrong. I don't think he would have settled for a demonstration of how things don't always work out the way you think. I think he would have actually taught the visiting rabbi and explained everything in perfect detail. That really seems to be Rambam's MO. He's not one for grand, dramatic, visual aids. He's one for careful, precise teaching. So no, if you ask me outright, I would say I don't believe that story happened the way it's often told. I believe it still teaches a very good point. And I believe that it teaches something that we need to remember very clearly, that we don't always understand what's happening. And oftentimes the halakha does permit what we don't realize it permits. But I don't actually believe it happened precisely as that story tells.
Yeah, sorry. What I meant to, I probably phrased that wrong. What I meant to say is, where'd that story come from? Because it seems weird, because it does sound untrue, but it seems weird that people would let that stand against Rambam.
Well, who was going to defend it? I mean, again, it's not that it's saying that Rambam was completely wrong. It is technically true. And if we just say that the calf that was slaughtered in the story was slaughtered shortly after the mother was slaughtered, but not in the sight of the visiting rabbi, then it becomes perfectly fine. All you'd have to do would be give the calf a bit of a towel dry so it's not wet from the amniotic fluid, bring it in from the barn and club it, and you still fulfill the halakha without changing the story much. But the story, that at least the version I read, did not go into that much detail. So it is possible to make this entirely within the halakha. It just doesn't make the story read as clearly or as compellingly. And that's the way that we tell stories. We often streamline things to make a point, even when the point could be made with a little bit more work. It might not be as elegant. All right, and then the last section of Mishnah 4:5, if he ripped open the mother, meaning that if it wasn't a proper slaughter and found in it a living 9-month fetus, it must be slaughtered since its mother had not been slaughtered. Again, slaughtered is a technical term for shechita, for proper Jewish slaughter. And so if you kill the mother, maybe you needed to put it out of its misery, but it couldn't be made kosher regardless. Maybe it was treifa, had been attacked by an animal, and inside there is a 9-month viable fetus. That fetus can be slaughtered and can be eaten correctly, but you do have to actually slaughter it. Even though its mother died, it is still available for proper shechita if it is a viable fetus, if it has reached that status. Okay, Mishnah 4:6. Well, let's talk about limbs. But now we are at a regular animal. We are not talking about the limbs of a fetus. We are talking about the limbs of just a regular cow, sheep, goat, kosher animal. But you can see, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that since we were talking about the fetus, and then we talked about the fetus with the limb coming out, and then we talked about the fetus dying, then we talked about the mother dying, then we talked about slaughtering the fetus. Now that we've had that introduction of limbs, let's go back and talk about limbs in general. There is a mnemonic structure to this. It is not completely random and haphazard. It's not exactly thematically building, but there is a thematic line that might make it easier to memorize. Okay, so we have two different questions, as Rabbi Kolb points out in his introduction: the status of a treifa as treifa of an animal whose limb has been broken off, and a limb hanging from an animal, and whether it is still considered to be part of the animal. So, if the hind legs of an animal were cut off below the joint, meaning the knee, it is permitted. If above the joint, it is treifa. So, there are, as he points out, three parts to the animal's leg. Right, the lowest part is the foot, the middle part is the calf, and the upper part is the thigh. The place where the foot is attached to the calf and the place where the calf is attached to the thigh are both called a berech, which in modern Hebrew means the knee. But in the Talmud, they would debate which joint is the joint. If it is the upper one, then it would mean that an animal whose leg has been severed below the knee, or what we call the knee, is not a treifa. If it is the lower one, then only if it is severed below the place where the foot joins the calf is it not treifa. Now, so too, if the juncture of tendons was gone, it is treifa. This juncture of tendons refers to the tendons which connect the thigh to the knee. If these are missing, the animal is treifa, even if the bone is still whole. Now, I don't mean to be gruesome, but this can happen if there is a tearing or rending around the leg and the muscle and tendons have pulled back. The bone might still be touching, but it is practically severed. And if that fleshy part has withdrawn, then even if the bone is still connected, it is already considered treifa. Everyone with me on the anatomy? Part 4, if the bone was broken, but the greater part of the flesh around the fracture remained, it is rendered clean by slaughtering. Otherwise, it is not rendered clean by the slaughtering. So we talked in the last part, part 3, about if the flesh had pulled back and the bone was still there. Now we're basically doing the opposite. The bone has been broken, but the flesh is still there, or at least the majority of the flesh is still around the wound where the bone is broken. So, as he points out, a limb that was separated from the animal when the animal was still alive cannot be rendered clean by slaughtering the animal, right? That's ever min hahai. A broken bone does not mean the limb must be considered separate, right? Just because it's broken doesn't mean it is detached. As long as most of the flesh, the meat, the muscle remains, the limb is part of the animal. And when the animal is slaughtered, the limb is permitted and clean. Again, this is if it is lower than the joint. But if most of the flesh does not remain, then the limb is not considered as part of the animal, even though it is still dangling attached, and the limb is unclean, even after the animal is slaughtered. Okay, probably more than you wanted to know about slaughtering. And if you thought that was an unappetizing topic, let's talk about the placenta, or amniotic sac. So, if a person slaughtered an animal and found in it an amniotic sac, he who is not fastidious may eat it. Okay. I hope everybody's already had dinner or isn't eating right after this. The amniotic sac, or the placenta, is not considered to be food. It's not considered to be meat. And as such, if you find it, you may eat it, but only if you're the kind of person who eats that kind of thing, right? By not fastidious, it's like, as he puts it, not Rabbi Kolb puts it, if you don't mind eating the yucky parts, but this is yucky beyond yucky, right? In the ancient world, people would eat brains and they would eat kidneys and all sorts of things that many modern people will say, oh no, I'll never eat that. Although from what I understand, they're very tasty. I've never had the opportunity
In
because
Uruguay and Argentina, you eat every part of the cow.
Absolutely,
All
right,
the
absolutely.
ribs and more.
Absolutely, right. So in most other parts of the world, they will eat the other parts of the animal, the organs as well as the meat. In most modern American communities, you will not find people eating a lot of organs. On average, it varies on the community and the part and the animal and the part of animal. One exception to that, for example, is many people do still eat liver. But even in places where people will eat everything in the animal, most people are still going to turn up their nose at the placenta, at the afterbirth. That's the kind of thing that most people are still going to say, I'm going to pass. However, if you're the kind of person who wants to eat it, all right, you can go ahead and eat it, right? On a similar note, it, meaning the afterbirth, does not contract uncleanness, either food uncleanness or the uncleanness of nevela, right? As I pointed out, even though it is edible, it is not considered to be food. And since it is not food, it is not flesh, it is not meat, therefore it cannot be ritually unclean the same way other food can become ritually unclean. And if it is not slaughtered properly, since it's not really considered meat or part of the animal, it's not considered to be nevela, and therefore it is not giving the transmitting the impurity of nevela. So that has its own unique status. However, kavanah makes a difference. Intentionality makes a difference. If he intended to eat it, meaning if the person actually thought that it was going to be his lunch, if he was looking forward to eating it and wanted to eat it, then it becomes food. It can contract food uncleanness, but not the uncleanness of nevela. Right? You can transform it mentally from being nothing, just substance, into being food by your intention, your desire, your plan to eat it. However, that intention cannot turn it into nevela, because even regardless of your intentions, it is not considered part of the edible flesh of the animal. So the nevela uncleanness cannot become an issue. But the food uncleanness, meaning that it can become ritually impure, and if you were a Kohen, you would need to eat something only with ritual purity. All of those issues can apply if you're planning to eat it from the beginning. If you slaughter it and then you go, I'm hungry, I'll eat it, then it is not food, you're just chewing it. But if you're saying, boy, I sure can't wait until I get that afterbirth, then it is food and it must be treated as food. Is that clear at the moment before we get to part 5? Okay, again, I know not the most appetizing of topics. If part of the amniotic sac emerged before the slaughtering of the mother, it may not be eaten, for it is a sign of birth in a woman and also a sign of birth in an animal. So remember, as we said before, that when something is emerging, that it is considered to be, when the head has emerged, it's considered to be born. Well, with regards to the amniotic sac or the afterbirth, because it can often cover the head of what's being born while it's pushing out, and again, this is something that would be extremely dangerous before modern medicine, and even now, nothing to be ignored. Because the head might be inside of it, we have to assume that it was inside of it. And therefore, if the amniotic sac, if this afterbirth pushes out, even if it goes back in, we have to imagine that the head of the birth was inside of it, and therefore it is considered to have been born, right? So even when it goes back in and then we slaughter the mother, we still have to treat it as though it had been born, because part had emerged, this amniotic part had emerged. And that means that we then have to treat the animal as though it were a separate thing, and we have to treat the amniotic sac as though it were a separate thing. Okay, questions on that? Or we'll hit part 6. Okay, so part 6, we need to do a quick review, just a reminder that there is an issue of bechorot, of firstborn in Judaism, that the first animal born from its mother has a special status and has to be either donated as a sacrifice or usually redeemed, and then the redeemed value given to the temple. And that counts for the first animal that actually opens the womb. Very important classification of actually opening the womb. So if an animal which was pregnant for the first time miscarried an amniotic sac, meaning the afterbirth comes out as the first thing, it may be thrown to the dogs. But in the case of a consecrated animal, meaning an animal that you have designated as being sanctified, then the afterbirth, has to be buried. It may not be buried at crossroads or hung on a tree, for these are Amorite practices. Okay, so as I mentioned, that the firstborn carries with it a special status. However, this amniotic sac miscarriage afterbirth that's coming out does not have that same status, and therefore you can just throw it away because it is not considered to be sacred, because it is not considered to be the firstborn. Now, because it has been actually born, it would mean that any subsequent births no longer count as firstborns because it already opened the womb, and thus it wouldn't ever have a proper firstborn live birth. Now, the consecrated animal, of course, because you have designated all of it as being consecrated while the sac was still part of the animal, then when it comes out, it cannot be used for anything, and so it has to be disposed of, and so it is buried appropriately as any holy object which can't be used. Now, the rabbis add as a little bit of a coda here at the end that you can't bury it at the crossroads and you can't hang it from a tree. That is because these are Amorite practices, meaning these are superstitions of some of the other ancient cultures that were in the area at the time that the rabbis lived and the time when the people were in the land of Israel. And we cannot imitate their practices. And even though there is no magical power, or even if we weren't claiming there was magical power by burying it at the crossroads or doing something else with it, which were considered to be warding off evil spirits and all of that, even if we don't believe in it, even if we're not doing it with that in mind, we still can't do it because we would be aping their activities. And that goes not only for superstitions like this, but the religious practices of any other culture are ones that we cannot imitate, even if we don't intend for them to be religious. So a more recent example, as we are here in January, Jewish people should not be putting up Christmas trees. Even if you don't think that you're putting it up as a Christmas tree, even if it doesn't mean anything at all about Christmas to you, it is still an imitation of a religious practice of another religion. And it is inappropriate to be imitating that. And by way of comparison, I would personally also be offended if non-Jews imitate our practices. I get very miffed when I see non-Jewish preachers wearing a talit. I get very annoyed when I see people blowing the shofar, acting as though they are performing a Jewish rite for a non-Jewish activity, especially if they're not Jewish. So yes, I think we should be certainly getting rid of superstition, but also respecting the boundaries between our customs and other people's customs when it comes to our religious practices.
By the way, question, Rabbi, what about the
Yes.
snowman? Snowman for you is part of the Christmas or part of the winter spirit?
A snowman is just building a snowman. It's not superstition, it's not religion, it's just plain in the snow. So
No connotation with Christianity.
no connection that I've ever heard of with Christianity. And even if there was, it would have to be a pretty new one that somebody just recently invented, and I don't think would be considered widespread. And just because someone invents a connection doesn't mean we have to acknowledge it. Otherwise, someone could say that eating bread has a connection to another religion, and now we can't eat bread. So no, snowmen are perfectly fine. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, this came up a couple times. If they had a religious registry, I've seen a number of people who were Jewish say they'd put the name on the registry for like Muslims. And then you also heard stories of during the Holocaust where non-Jewish people would wear the Star of David.
Right. So in a time of crisis where people are trying to help one another or trying to hide from persecution or God forbid extermination, then of course we are allowed. If you need to pass yourself off as a priest in order to get out of Nazi Germany, by all means, do anything you can to escape. And likewise, if someone wants to stand with the Jews when they're being persecuted and they wish to show a display of solidarity by wearing the star, which by the way was forced on us, was not our choice at that time, then I applaud their act of solidarity and humanity. We're talking here about normal circumstances.
Yeah, I know. I was just wondering, how bad did it have to be? Because the last time I saw it come up was when Trump was elected, and obviously nothing bad, well, it didn't appear that anything bad was going to happen, or did.
Of people worried about religious registries or wearing stars? I don't remember that coming up in the last election. Maybe I missed that. But yes, hopefully we have not reached the point of forcing people to identify publicly their religion in order to be targets of persecution. I'd be very upset about that, and I certainly think I would have heard of it, but maybe there were other issues that I'm not aware of. It is a big country after all. All right, everyone, that will finish us up for tonight and finishes chapter 4. We will begin with chapter 5 next week. I hope everybody is doing well and keeping safe or doing the best they can. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.